Hello, everyone from Istanbul, and welcome to another FinTech Istanbul webinar today. Today, I have a special guest from London, Emrys Perry from Refinitiv. Hello, Emrys, and welcome to our webinar.
Hello, and thanks for inviting me.
Our pleasure. We're going to talk about digital customer onboarding solutions with Emrys today. And our topics will cover the importance of digital onboarding, both from the customers and company side, the effects of pandemic on digital onboarding process, the pain points in the market, both on the B2B and on the retail side, the role of regulators and compliance issues, pricing strategies of turnkey solutions in digital onboarding. So today we'll be talking about how to overcome these challenges, and also the opportunities of a turnkey customer digital onboarding solution with Emrys. Emrys, before we start, could you please introduce yourself and about the company?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, hi, I'm Emrys Perry, as was said just a second ago, and I'm a solution consultant specifically for KYC solutions at Refinitiv. And Refinitiv is part of the London Stock Exchange Group. Just to give a bit of an introduction as well into the organization. So Refinitiv and the London Stock Exchange Group, we have our risk division, and the risk division is the global market leader in the provision of risk solutions. And we really measure that in a number of different ways. But one of the key metrics that we use to measure that is the number of customers that we have, and we have in the region of about 16,000 companies who use our risk solutions. So we have a really, really large outfit in terms of the provision of these types of solutions. It's also quite interesting from a number of different perspectives, being the global market leader. And one of the perspectives is the amount of investment we have into the products that we develop, not only in terms of people on the ground physically developing our products, but also going into the market and acquiring solutions that we think will be interesting, and we think that will add to the product sets that we have and the product sets that we put out to the market. So in the past 12 months, we've acquired a couple of really, really interesting companies. We've acquired a company called GIACT, who does bank account verification, one called the Red Flag Group, which does enhanced due diligence checks, and really, really interestingly, we've acquired a company called the Global Data Consortium, who are really the wholesaler of identity verification checks, and we've incorporated those into our data sets. So there's lots of really, really interesting things that we're doing as Refinitiv and as part of the London Stock Exchange.
So perfect. You have some investments. Also, you made some acquisitions. That is perfect, which means that you are a well-known player in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I won't go into it too much, but we've also had some really interesting partnerships, global partnerships with MasterCard, but also, and I'm just going to touch on it really quickly. We've just announced a global partnership with Microsoft. And this is being, viewed by the media as big tech entering the financial services market for the first time through Refinitiv and through the London Stock Exchange. So we're developing all of their technology into our technology sets, and we're incorporating those together, including things like ChatGPT, which is generating a huge amount of excitement at the moment. So we're really excited to bring those products to market.
So let's keep ChatGPT on another session. So
yeah.
Let's continue with our topic about digital customer onboarding. So we can split the time into two phases, maybe before the pandemic or after the pandemic. So let's start about the importance of KYC and digital customer onboarding today for different sectors, or maybe some different industries. So what is the importance?
Yeah, perfect. So it's a really interesting question, right? And it comes down to, defining the word importance to some extent. I mean, if you work in a regulated sector, then there is a regulatory obligation in order to put KYC in place, in order to understand the customers that you're dealing with. And if you don't do something like this, then you'll end up getting a regulatory fine, okay? So it's important from that respect. It's important to protect your company against getting these regulatory fines. And of course, this is expanding, right? You know, historically, we've seen regulated companies being directed at the financial services sector. And now we're seeing the expansion of that. We're seeing the expansion into things like high value goods. So art houses, auction houses are being included within this. Real estate is being included within this. And if you look into, you know, the issues of money laundering, and you see, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a lot of press out there which gives a very good indication as to why real estate, art houses, auction houses, etc., are now being included as a method to prevent or to help prevent money laundering. But I think, interestingly, importance can be defined, you know, not just from the perspective of avoiding a fine. You know, it could be, for example, a means of increasing revenue. And that sounds like a funny topic, doesn't it? You know, how can KYC be a means of increasing revenue? So, and we see this a lot when we look at very specific sectors. So when we look at things like online trading, when we look at crypto exchanges, when we look at digital wealth managers, there is currently an arms race going on in order to attract individuals into investing. You know, historically, again, we saw professional investors, right? We saw high net worth individuals, people with millions of net worth being involved in these organizations. But now, through the use of technology, we're getting to a time whereby the regular person on the street can invest their money, where the regular person on the street who has maybe 10,000 as opposed to 10 million can engage with wealth managers to understand their wealth. And the way that they do this is not through one-on-one interactions. The way that they do this is through automation. You know, they have to go onto a website, they have to onboard themselves in a fully automated way. And then they can invest and they can get the ideas in a fully automated way as well. And of course, you know, the people on the street, they're used to Netflix, they're used to Amazon, they're used to, you know, fast methods of delivery. They don't want to come onto the website of a crypto exchange and find that they can't onboard themselves. So the onboarding process is extremely important within this process, and you know, within the business model of attracting customers and getting them onto the platform. And the person who is very good at the onboarding phase will be the person who will ultimately be the most successful in the future. And there's a really interesting story about this as well. We were working with a large wealth manager, and we were looking at dropout rates. So how many people started the journey to onboard themselves, but then dropped off? Mm-hmm. What we found is 60% at the time were dropping off. And then really, really importantly, we found that of that 60%, 30%, so half of that, never came back. And so we worked it out. We said, well, what is the average revenue per person that you onboard? And we said, okay, well, it's X. And we worked it out over the total number, that was the 30%. And we found out that they were losing in the region of about 90 million per year. Wow. Because their onboarding process was not right. So you can see now, when we look at the importance, it's not only about regulatory fines, right? It's about being able to effectively onboard people. It's about stopping dropout rates, and it's about looking at your overall company strategy and aligning that with a really effective onboarding process.
Perfect. So as far as I understand from your case, KYC was always a hot topic, and it was always important. But I think pandemic changed something in the KYC process. I mean, and the importance of the KYC landscape. So let's talk about a little bit after pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, you're right. And the pandemic, changed everything for lots of people, right?
Yeah.
And we were dealing with customers throughout the pandemic, and we were talking to them, and we were talking to, what is your process? What does that look like at the moment? And again, that was interesting and almost a bit balmy. It takes one of these big global events in order to realize how ridiculous these concepts are that we have in place that we just do every single day and don't think about it. And in the case of pre-pandemic, the way that a lot of companies were operating was physically sending company reps out in order to pick up documentation. So and this could be part of a meeting with a customer. Pre-pandemic, we had lots more meetings with customers, but there were often times where the meeting with the customer had happened already, and you just had to drive somewhere to pick up this documentation. But the customer was valuable, so he said, well, I'll take the day out and I'll drive there and just pick this stuff up. And so not only were many hours wasted doing these tasks, it was totally inefficient from a business perspective, getting your customer reps to go and pick up documentation like this, but also it wasn't particularly good in terms of a customer experience. I mean, for a company, fine, but for an individual, if the customer rep can't get there, what's the alternative? That they post the information, and you're taking a sensitive document, you're putting it in the post, you're sending it and hoping for the best. And also you've got to take time out of your day to do that. So it's a terrible customer experience to go and do something like this. So again, we did a lot of work with customers around this time, and we were looking into what they're doing and ways to improve this. And one of the things that we found was that we could break up their groups of customers, particularly, and I'm talking now particularly within the retail arm, and when we were looking at high net worth individuals, for example, we looked at breaking them up. And we broke them up into those which were tech savvy and those which were not tech savvy. So who can go onto a computer, upload their documentation, and who can't? And what we realized is, even though these people were high net worth individuals, a lot of them were tech savvy and totally happy to go through this process. It was no problem for them whatsoever. So, there were many improvements that could be made by introducing automation, by introducing the concept of digital KYC. You send a customer a link and you ask them to upload something through a secure portal, as opposed to emailing something, which poses some risks in terms of GDPR. It poses some security risks, or even worse, mailing something, posting through the post box. So there were some things that they could consider in that respect.
So I have another question. At that moment, at the time of pandemic, we had some encouragements, guidance, and some recommendations from the Financial Action Task Force. So what was the role of the FATF at this stage?
Yeah, okay. So they released a really interesting document, actually, the Financial Action Task Force, around the time of the pandemic. And it was a guidance to digital identity. And it was talking about, what you should consider, etc. And of course, the Financial Action Task Force, if you ever read any of their documents, they never say, do this, right? Yeah. They always say, these are the pros, cons, this is what you need to think about, take a risk-based approach, etc. So it was written in that style. But one of the really interesting things that was written within that document in relation to risk, the document firstly advocated the use of technology within these scenarios. And secondly, it said that using technology might even lower the risk to your organization. Now, that as a concept sounds interesting. Why would it lower the risk to use technologies? I mean, surely there's no lower risk than doing it face to face, right? But that's not the case, because, within the technology steps, rather than taking an ID document, having a look at it and saying, yeah, that's fine, the technology can scan those documents. And it can look at the things like the micro text, the fine lines in the background. It can look at the font written on and the size of the letters, things that you would never pick up yourself if you were looking at this document and it happened to be a fake document that you were holding. You couldn't pick this stuff up. And then what technology could do is it could do a biometric face scan of the individual. And it could look at things like the distance between their eyes, the size of their nose, the length of their mouth, things like this to determine, right, you know, the person, the picture in this document is actually the person that we have in front of us. Again, things that the human being would find difficult in order to do this sort of stuff. And so, you know, when you look at technology like that, and also you add things like automation, you know, how do we risk score this person, for example? How do we rescreen them in the future, for example? How do we automate all of these processes? You can see why the Financial Action Task Force said it may even be lower risk to use technology than to do things face to face. And you can see that it absolutely would be lower risk. And that's why we're seeing so many companies moving to a digital process now.
So, as far as I understand from your thoughts, digital ID is the key, I mean, right now in the corporate strategy. So, in terms of implementing a strategy, you need to understand the regulation, as you said a few minutes ago. But as we know, each region has its own legislation on digital ID and customer onboarding. So, if we want to create a KYC strategy on the corporate level, what are the key regulations differs in the areas, or what are the key regulation differences to look out for when deploying a multi-region KYC strategy?
Yeah, okay, yeah, really good question, right? And there'll be people who listen to this and are thinking, well, we're looking to deploy a multi-regional strategy. Yeah. And when you look at country to country, I mean, you know, even countries that are grouped regionally very close to each other, there can be nuances in the way that they understand the recommendations from FATF and the way that they deploy this. So there are a number of these types of differences. And when we look at this in terms of the individual and capturing information about the individual, for example, this is where we see some of the more obvious differences. So there are countries, for example, whereby capturing the static image of an individual, that's the requirement, okay? And that's the most efficient way in which to do it, because you can put the onboarding process completely into the hands of the individual that you're onboarding, and then the automated experience can help them through and do the job for them. There are some countries whereby the static image is not enough, and what they need is a video image. Mm-hmm. And with a video image, it's a bit like this, a bit like the way that we're talking to each other at the moment. And we would have that onboarding experience, and some way through that, you would say, oh, now can you hold up your ID? And I'd hold my ID up to the camera, and then it would capture the picture of my ID and me talking to you, and that would be the process. So that's something to look out for. And then there's a third process that's coming into being at the moment. And this third process, I believe, will become the predominant process in the future. And this is electronic identification. And we're seeing this through the likes of companies like Bank ID in Scandinavian countries. I think it was originated in Sweden, but growing in Scandinavian countries. And there are other variations of this as well, which is effectively a token-based system whereby you can bypass your own security methods. All of your ID is held behind or within your security, and then you can deploy that to whoever you want without having to physically take pictures of ID documents and selfies and everything else. It's the security method that acts as your proof as to who you are, and then the release of that documentation to you. So there are those things to think about as well. Now, we worked with a very large auction house in relation to this. And one of the things that they were doing was they were looking to roll out a consistent approach globally, effectively because they realized that if there was a country where the regulation was lower, then people who wanted to buy high value goods from their auctions could bid through this country, and it would be easy access in terms of in order to launder funds. So what they wanted to do was they wanted to roll out a consistent global strategy. So rather than saying, right, take it country by country, understand each nuance in each different country, and then deploy a strategy with every single different possibility, what they were looking to do, a little bit different, was say, we're going to take the strictest method and we're going to roll that out over every single country. And we're going to do this so it doesn't matter where in the world you are, your onboarding experience will be exactly the same. So it also depends what type of business you are. You know, is it possible to roll out a consistent strategy whereby everyone is onboarded in the same way? Or, you know, in the scenario where maybe you're involved in a couple of different countries, maybe you want to look at it on a country by country basis. So that there's a couple of different methods. There is some complexity to this, more so than we can talk about here, but in general, they're the types of things to think about.
Wow, perfect. So, but in the system, I believe there are many types of screening, like for your retail, or we can say institutional. What do I need to consider if I'm screening both individuals and companies at the same time? I believe you have some cases. Could you give some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, the first thing though to note for anybody who's new to this in particular is that screening companies is much more complex versus screening individuals. Okay, when you're screening an individual at a very basic level, you're looking at doing your AML screening for sanctions, PEPs, etc. You're looking to do ID verification. You're looking to do a risk questionnaire, which perhaps puts them into a risk category, and you're looking at different rules per risk categorization for your individual. In a nutshell, for individuals. When you're looking at doing companies, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because it can start to get more complex. The reason it can start to get more complex is because you need to take a company and you also need to look at the ultimate beneficial owners of that organization, and you need to look at the directors in that organization. You need to look at not only collecting that information, i.e. asking the company for it, but you need to verify that information as well, i.e. look at company registers and say, yep, these are the directors that belong to that country, that company. So there's more to do in that respect. Then when it comes to ongoing screening, there becomes even more to do, because say, for example, you're listening and you're from a fund. You know, when you have a fund, you have some money, and then you might want to split that by into different asset managers, and the different asset managers might look after different asset classes, and the different asset classes might have different products underneath it, but it all relates to one fund. And then you need to think about ongoing screening. You know, how do you offboard somebody if they stop investing with you, or how do you know that they have invested in multiple products with you? And how do you manage that from that perspective? So again, it comes into more complexity if you're looking at doing this for companies as opposed to individuals. And these are the types of things that you could need to think about. One of the things that I'd recommend, though, when looking at this sort of thing, is think about your budget. Your budget's really, really important. The size of the tool needs to be relative to the size of the job, right? And what we find is sometimes, we deal with companies whereby they have X percentage, maybe 80% or 90% are retail, and then 10% are institutional in terms of their customer base. And what we generally say when we deal with types of organizations, we say, look, 50% of your budget will do 80% of the job. And that's really, really important, because if you don't have an unlimited budget, like most companies don't have an unlimited budget, you need to think about how to use it in the most intelligent way. And that might not be automating everything. What that might be is actually looking at this and deciding which parts of it you want to automate. There are also other things to think about, things like geography, what technology is available within the countries that you're doing business within. For example, if you're doing bank account verification, you might want to use open banking as a tool in which to achieve bank account verification. But open banking is not readily available in every single country and have huge take-up in certain countries. So you need to look at the geographies that you're dealing within in order to understand the technology types that are useful within those different geographies. And you need to look at the demographic as well, the demographic of the people that you're dealing with. Are your customers people who come through your website, or are your customers ultra high net worth individuals? There's a different way in which you want to deal with your customers depending on who they are. So these are the things. And then finally, you want to look at things like the size of your team. The more you screen against, the more data sets you screen against, the more results you're going to get. And the more results you're going to get, the more people you're going to need in order to view those results and do something with that information. The one thing worse than not screening is you end up with a whole load of information, and that information might give you some clues as to what to do with this customer, but you have nobody to deal with it. And then when you get audited, they have a look at this information and they say, well, it was available to you, why didn't you do something with it? And the answer might be because the team wasn't big enough. So you need to think about these things as well. So there's lots of different things to think about in this respect.
So it seems a little bit confusing. I had some notes as you were speaking, but I think at the end you clarified that confusion. You started with the budgets, then the technology in terms of the geography and the demographics, and also with the team. But I can imagine that that process is highly sensitive to pricing. So let's say that I'm trying to buy a turnkey solution. So what do I need to consider if I'm searching a turnkey solution for screening both individuals and the companies?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, good question, actually. And lots of companies come and they're looking for this. And just so people who are listening know what we're talking about here, a turnkey solution, or maybe otherwise known as an off-the-shelf solution, is something that you don't necessarily put a lot of bespoke work into it. You buy it and then you can use it as it is, in order to do your onboarding. And there are some real advantages to this, right? From a cost perspective, in particular, if you're a smaller organization looking to take on a solution, and you don't want to invest tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands into bespoking this solution, then maybe you want to look for something that's a bit more off the shelf. So if you're doing this, there's a couple of things to think about, and the main thing to think about is fitting your processes into the system that's being provided. Can you do this? Now, of course, the more complex the system is in terms of, off the shelf, the more fitting you've got to do, the more you've got to fit your processes into that solution. But you can also pick up solutions that just do parts of the process. So, for example, they do the collection of information, and they do the screening of an individual, and then that's all they do. So you can keep things like your questionnaires, which might be your questionnaires are typically based on your risk policy, and the risk policy is specific to your company. So you might want to keep those away from the system for the time being, and make sure you get a system that's concise, but you can fit your own processes into it. Like I said, you need to accept that some of the parts of your process will remain manual. Okay, you can get off-the-shelf systems that you can put some light configuration into, but let's just use an example that you're not going to do that. Then some parts will remain a little bit more manual. But I think the overarching thing is make sure that the solution fits with your requirements. You know, you're going to have an idea about what you want to do, and there are going to be systems out there, and some of them are going to be really cheap, and some of them are going to be really expensive. And there's a difference between these two systems, right? Not everybody knows this. It's not obvious at the beginning. When the salesperson is talking to you, it might not be so obvious why this one's cheap and why this one's expensive, but there are differences between them. So make sure that you do enough digging to understand what those differences are, because it's those differences that will make a big difference once you've deployed it as to whether it will be fit for the purpose or not fit for purpose. And I'm not saying, by the way, that cheap solutions are not fit for purpose. By the way, I'm absolutely not saying that. They are fit for purpose, but they're fit for certain purposes. Once organizations become more complex, once the need becomes higher, once you want to add more automation, etc., then it's the more expensive solutions that can do this sort of thing. So you've got to look at your organization, and you've got to look at the types of products on the market, and you've got to make sure there's a fit.
Well, so as I understand, this is a very sensitive process, and you need to make a precise strategy to take these products into your system, because it's going to be maybe the core system of your process. So right now, we have already talked about the past of digital onboarding. I mean, on the onboarding side. What is happening now in the sector, and right now we can talk about the future expectations about digital onboarding.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone loves talking about the future, right? Yeah. What's coming up, and nowhere is more exciting, I think, than the future of digital onboarding, because it incorporates all the exciting stuff that we talk about every single day. But what's not exciting? Let's start there. What's unexciting about the world at the moment? And what's unexciting or old, for example, are and I've got a version here: paper documents. You know, it's one of those things that they already feel old, right? You know, you go through security and you get a physical stamp in a paper document, and the whole thing feels, you know, like it was like 20 years ago, and you think, well, it's 2023, surely we have something better than this. So I think, you know, the first thing about the future is we're definitely going to see the phase out of these paper documents, paper ID cards, plastic driving licenses, paper passports, etc. We're going to see the phase out of this sort of thing, and we're going to see the digitization of identity documents in the future. But then the question is, you know, who will control this? Who will control paper documents, and what will it look like, you know, in the future? Because the old story of when you were designing the car, somebody might have turned around and said, look, what we need is a mechanical horse, right? You know, it's the same with ID documents. Just because they're digitizing, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get the same group of ID documents that we've got now. We might have something different, and we don't know what that looks like yet. But it might be the case that we have national IDs. It's been something being touted in different countries for a long time. You get countries, you know, like France, where you think, well, that will never happen. But you get countries like the UK, where we seem to be edging closer to it. So, and then you might have things like passports and driving licenses attached to your personal ID, your one ID. So this might happen. But then the other thing to look at in the future is who's going to control this stuff. You know, is it going to be governments who control it? Well, maybe it might be. But it might be a bank. You know, we talked about bank ID within the Scandinavian regions and the prominence of that, and how they're looking to roll that out as they gain such positive traction. So it might be the banks that control this, but also it might be private companies. You know, you look at companies like Apple, for example. and the ecosystem that Apple have and the ability for them to roll something out is absolutely massive. So you might see companies like Apple, private companies, taking ownership of this. And of course, that leads to questions like, how will they allow access to this information? And to which external companies will they allow access to it? So, you know, we're going to see this sort of thing play out as well. ID documentation changing to digital, owned by either governments, maybe banks, maybe private companies, and how we're going to get access to that. And then, of course, you know, a topic which is a whole topic in itself, AI, right? How is AI going to influence the way that we onboard customers in the future? And I'll tell you a story. It's a little bit unrelated, but it just points in the direction of the power of AI. I was writing an article the other day, and in fact, as a professor, maybe this will come in handy for you as well, or maybe when you're looking at your students. So I was writing an article, and I thought in my mind, I wonder if I asked the question to ChatGPT, I wonder what answer it would give. And you know, the article that ChatGPT wrote, which was on a really niche topic, was better than the article that I had just written. If you can imagine, you know, it's absolutely incredible. So you can see that AI will play a huge part in asking questions to customers, for example, in determining what risk they pose to the organization, in enhancing those questions. You know, if someone is high risk, well, let's ask them more questions because we need to find out more information about them. So the AI chatbot systems, which are still in their relative infancy at the moment, you know, might become the system that handles that initial interaction, and also the system that handles future interactions. You know, there's 100 things that might change during the lifespan of your relationship with your customers. For example, if you're looking at UBOs, ultimate beneficial owners, well, they might change. You know, different people might become ultimate beneficial owners. The director structure might change. You know, they might become a high-risk company because they are based within a high-risk country, and the country's risk might change. So there are many factors all being played out here, and factors that is very difficult for the human mind to keep up with. But for an artificial intelligence, it's not necessarily difficult for them to keep up with this. So we're going to see a lot of integration from AI in the future of KYC onboarding as well. And then the final thing to point out is integration between companies, so providers of data, providers of technology. You know, if we looked at technology 10 years ago, what we saw was individual companies looking to provide solutions to the marketplace. If we look at technology now, we see ecosystems of multiple companies acting together in order to provide solutions, taking best-in-class tiny pieces of the solution, all working together in order to produce that solution. And I think we're going to see the enhancement of that. We're going to see, you know, we talked before about different regions having different rule sets. We talked about who would own these different data sets, data sources. So if there is a specific country that you want to operate in, you need to integrate with their data sets, for example. And we're going to see the enhancement of this, more companies working together, larger groups of ecosystems, whereby, you know, purchasing a KYC system will be purchasing into an ecosystem. And we'll see that growing, I think, in the future as well.
Well, Emre's, as far as I can understand from these topics, ID is a dynamic data. I mean, it's a dynamic structure. So, I mean, in the future, maybe we could see some dynamic data structures, ID structures, to be followed by the chatbots. So one thing remained untouched in this chat is, I think, the security part. Since ID is the most valuable data, how could we secure that data, or how could we overcome those fraud issues?
Yeah, okay, absolutely. So there are two parts to this, right? There's the security part and the fraud part. So let's take the security part to begin with, and security is all relative, right? So relative to what we have at the moment, relative to best in class, and where we sit on that chain. So what we have at the moment in terms of security, or what some companies are deploying at the moment, is when you take documents, we take identity documents, we can, as we mentioned, you can send them to somebody. That's not particularly secure, right? You can photocopy them. It used to be the case that you photocopied it, you signed it, you dated it, and that's how you did it. And that's not particularly secure, because what happens to that piece of data? What happens to that piece of paper? Where does that go? Or even worse, you can email them. And over the course of time, what do you end up with? Well, you end up with hundreds of ID documents spread across many email accounts, which is an absolute headache from a data protection perspective. So, what is better than that? What is better than that, and what customers are becoming more demanding of, is being able to deploy their data in a secure way, where they know that it's not going to be kept in a filing cabinet or hanging around in someone's email. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing now is secure portals. So you can send somebody a link, they can click onto it, or you can embed a link into a website, they can click onto it, they enter a secure portal, they enter their information, and that information then gets stored in a secure location. So it's away from people being able to access it outside of those who absolutely need to access it. So we're seeing that at the moment, and from a security perspective, as the enhancement of what were perhaps past practices. And then from a fraud perspective, and we alluded to this, previously, where we talked about the document and being able to look at the microtext and the fine lines and the fonts and everything else on the document itself to avoid fraud. But then there are also enhancements of fraud prevention. So, for example, you can look at the geolocation of somebody. We have an individual who says that they're in Turkey and are looking to onboard themselves. But hold on a second, they're not in Turkey. The geolocation says that they're somewhere else, and are actually operating from a high-risk country somewhere. So that could be a flag to say, there's a fraud risk here. And we can do that the same in terms of, looking at the system that they're using, looking at the email address that they're using, looking at the risk associated with the phone number that they're using. And, there are databases out there whereby either your email address, or it might not be your email address that carries the high risk, but the proximity of your email address to email addresses that are high risk, which suggests that there might be some connection. So there are things like this, not only with email addresses, but with phone numbers. We talk about geolocation and many other items like this, which look to identify fraud within the system. So there are lots of things that can be done around fraud.
Wow, perfect. So that was a very valuable chat indeed for me, and also for the audience, I believe. So, but unfortunately, we came to an end. So thank you for your thoughts and for your comments on that topic. So hope to see you again in FinTech Istanbul. And thank you again for being with us.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Emrys.